The wind was a thief, and its currency was sand. It stole the breath from Evelyn Moore's lungs and scoured the tears from her cheeks before they had a chance to fall. The fine white silk of the wedding dress, a garment meant to signify her sale, not her union, was now ripped at the hem and coated in the red dust of the Arizona Territory. It clung to her like a shroud, a ghostly reminder of the life she was fleeing. Each rasping breath was a victory against the storm and against the man she'd left standing at the hastily erected altar in her father's barn. Harlan Morgan. The name tasted like ash in her mouth. He wasn't a suitor. He was a land baron collecting a debt. Her father's failing horse ranch was the price. And she, at 19, was the final signature on the deed. She had seen the look in Morgan's eyes, a hard, brittle ownership that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with possession. He would not be gentle. He would not be kind. He would break her as easily as he broke a wild stallion. So she had run. One moment, she was standing beside him, the preacher's words a meaningless drone against the rising howl of the wind. The next, she had hitched the cumbersome skirt and bolted through the barn's side door, vanishing into the blinding, swirling chaos of the sudden dust storm. Shouts had followed her, but the wind swallowed them whole, just as it was now trying to swallow her. She had no plan, no destination. Her world had only ever been the dusty expanse of her father's land, a place of cracked earth and thirsty horses. Beyond it lay only stories and maps. Red Hollow was the only town she knew, a miserable little collection of buildings huddled against the unforgiving sun. But she couldn't go there. Morgan's influence was long, his reach like the creeping fingers of the drought. She had to go where he wouldn't think to look, away from the roads, away from the river, into the wilderness. The world was a maelstrom of red and brown. The sun was gone, choked out of the sky. Evelyn stumbled on, guided by nothing but instinct. Her hands held up to shield her face from the stinging pellets of sand. Her lungs burned. Her legs, unaccustomed to such a desperate flight, ached with a fire that matched the one in her throat. How long had she been running? An hour. An eternity. Time had dissolved in the tempest. Then the storm changed its voice. The dry, rustling hiss of sand began to give way to a deeper, more ominous rumble. A flicker of pale light tore across the bruised sky, and for a terrifying, illuminating second, she saw the landscape around her: jagged rocks, skeletal mesquite trees, and an endless, empty horizon. The light vanished, and a crash of thunder followed, so profound it seemed to shake the very bones of the earth. The first drop of rain was a shock against her hot skin, then another, and another. Within moments, the dust was turning to mud, and the wind carried not sand, but a cold, driving rain. Her flimsy silk dress, already ruined, became a sodden, heavy weight. The chill seeped into her bones, replacing the burning panic with a desperate, shivering fear. She would die out here. Pneumonia would take her if a coyote or a fall didn't first. Just as the last sliver of hope began to gutter in her heart, she saw it, a light. It was faint, a warm, golden smudge against the relentless gray of the downpour. It seemed to float in the distance, a lone star fallen to earth. It could be anyone. It could be Morgan's men, already searching. It could be bandits. But the alternative was certain death in the storm. Clenching her teeth against their chattering, Evelyn forced her numb legs to move, stumbling toward the light. It was a cabin, small and crudely built, nestled against a low rise of rock that offered it some small protection from the wind. It was more of a shack, really, with a stone chimney puffing a steady stream of smoke that was immediately torn apart by the gale. A larger, darker structure stood beside it, its wide doors suggesting a workshop or a stable. The light came from a single, grimy window in the cabin. She crept closer, her bare feet sinking into the muck. There were no horses tied outside, no sign of a wagon. It seemed a place of solitude, the home of a man who did not welcome company. This was the edge of the territory, miles from Red Hollow. Perhaps, just perhaps, it was safe. Her knock on the rough-hewn wooden door was feeble, lost in the roar of the storm. She tried again, pounding with the side of her fist, her knuckles scraping against the splintered wood. No answer. Shivering uncontrollably now, her body racked with cold and exhaustion. She tried the latch. It wasn't barred. The door creaked open under her desperate push, swinging inward into a wall of near-total darkness. The sudden warmth that washed over her was a blessing. It was a dense, humid heat, thick with the smell of wood smoke, hot metal, and something else. Something clean, like pine soap. The only light came from the dying, orange glow of embers in a large stone fireplace on the far wall. It cast long, dancing shadows that made the small space seem vast and menacing. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice a raw croak. Silence. The only reply was the crackle of the fire and the ceaseless drumming of rain on the roof. She took a tentative step inside, pulling the heavy door shut behind her, plunging the room into even deeper gloom. Her eyes struggled to adjust. The cabin was a single room, sparsely furnished. A narrow cot was pushed against one wall, a rough wooden table and a single chair against another. Her gaze was drawn to the source of the heat, not just the fireplace, but the forge that was built into it, its great leather bellows lying still beside a silent anvil. This was a blacksmith's home. And then she saw it. In the center of the room, a large wooden bathtub. Steam rising from its surface in lazy, ghostly tendrils that caught the faint firelight. The air was thick with its heat. Someone had just been bathing, or was still bathing. A spike of pure terror shot through her. She wasn't alone. She spun around, her hand fumbling for the door latch. But her mind was a whirlwind of panic, and her body was clumsy with cold. She took a backward step, her eyes still scanning the oppressive shadows for any sign of movement. Her foot caught on the edge of a bearskin rug she hadn't seen in the dark. Her balance, already precarious, was gone. A small, choked cry escaped her lips as she pitched forward, her arms flailing uselessly. She wasn't falling toward the hard-packed earth floor. She was falling toward the steam, toward the water. The impact was a dizzying, chaotic sensation, a splash of shockingly hot water, a tangle of heavy, waterlogged silk, and the solid, unyielding reality of another body beneath her. For a moment, there was only stunned silence, broken by the storm outside. Evelyn was submerged to her waist in hot, soapy water, sprawled awkwardly across the lap of a man whose presence she had only just discovered. The thin, soaked material of her dress was no barrier at all. She could feel the hard muscle of his legs beneath her, the solid wall of his chest against her side. Her mind refused to process it. It was a nightmare, an absurdity beyond comprehension. She tried to scramble back, to pull away, but her limbs were tangled in her sodden dress. And her movements only resulted in another awkward splash and a more intimate collision with the stranger. Slowly, as if moving through molasses, she lifted her head. The embers in the fireplace cast just enough light to illuminate the scene. He was large, broad-shouldered, his dark, wet hair slicked back from his face. His eyes, wide with an astonishment that mirrored her own, were fixed on her. They were dark, unreadable pools in a face that was all hard angles and shadow, framed by a short, rough beard. He wasn't old, perhaps not yet 30, but his face was etched with a weariness that spoke of more years than he had lived. There was no anger in his expression, no menace, only a profound, bottomless shock. This was Jack Callahan, the town recluse, the ex-cavalryman who lived alone at the edge of the world, hammering out his days in fire and steel. A man whispered to have a darkness in his past, a man nobody in Red Hollow dared to bother. And she, Evelyn Moore, a virgin who had never been so much as held by a man she didn't flinch from, had just fallen into his bath. The heat of the water was nothing compared to the fire that scorched her cheeks. Shame, potent and paralyzing, flooded her. She was a ridiculous sight, a half-drowned bride in a ruined dress, draped over a naked stranger in his own tub. The sheer, unholy awkwardness of the moment was a physical weight. I'm sorry, she stammered, the words catching in her throat. The storm. I tripped. Jack Callahan didn't speak. He just stared, his gaze moving from her face to the ridiculous spectacle she presented. His stillness was more unnerving than any shout would have been. He seemed carved from the very rock his cabin was built against, a figure of absolute solitude whose peace had just been spectacularly shattered. With a strength that felt entirely his own, he shifted, helping her untangle her legs without touching her more than was absolutely necessary. He moved with a quiet economy, a deliberateness that was both unnerving and, strangely, calming. He wasn't rough. He wasn't angry. He was simply dealing with the situation. He rose from the tub in one fluid motion, water streaming from his powerful frame. He turned his back to her instantly, a gesture of innate decency that struck her as utterly incongruous with the terrifying whispers she'd heard about him. He was a shadow moving against the firelight, reaching for a towel hanging from a peg on the wall. Evelyn, still sitting in the rapidly cooling water, couldn't move. She just watched him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The steam, the scent of pine, the flickering orange light, it all combined into a surreal tableau. This was the most vulnerable she had ever been, in the presence of a man said to be dangerous, and yet, in that moment, the only real threat seemed to be the mortification that was threatening to consume her whole. He wrapped the towel around his waist and turned back, his expression still unreadable. He looked at her, at the pathetic, shivering girl in his bathtub, and for the first time, his gaze softened with something that might have been pity. He walked over to the narrow cot, pulled a thick wool blanket from it, and came back to stand beside the tub. He held it out to her. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, gravelly thing, rough with disuse. Get out before you catch a chill. It wasn't a request. It was a quiet, simple command, numbly. Evelyn did as she was told. She clambered out of the tub, dripping water and shame onto the floor. The ruined dress clung to her, outlining her form with unforgiving clarity. She couldn't meet his eyes, keeping her gaze fixed on the floor as she took the blanket from him. Their fingers brushed for a fraction of a second, and a jolt, like lightning, went through her. His skin was warm. She wrapped the coarse, dry wool around her shoulders, huddling into its warmth. It smelled of him of wood smoke, metal, and the faint, clean scent of the outdoors. Jack turned away again. Moving to the fireplace, he stoked the embers, adding a few small logs from a pile nearby. Flames licked up, casting a more certain, steady light across the room. He did not look at her. He did not ask her name, or where she came from, or why she had burst into his home like a panicked ghost. He pointed a thumb toward the single wooden chair near the hearth. Sit, get warm. Evelyn obeyed, her legs trembling as she crossed the small distance and sank into the chair. She pulled the blanket tighter, tucking her feet up beneath her, trying to make herself as small as possible. She watched him as he pulled on a pair of rough work trousers and a linen shirt, his movements efficient and silent. He was a man of few words, and even fewer comforts, but he had not thrown her back out into the storm. Dressed, he didn't sit. He didn't try to speak to her. He walked to the cabin's single window, pushing aside the hide that covered it and peering out into the black, rain-lashed night. He stood there like a sentinel, his broad back to her, a silent, imposing figure framed against the tempest. The rain hammered down, a relentless, roaring chorus. The fire crackled and spat, its warmth slowly, blessedly, seeping into Evelyn's frozen limbs. Exhaustion, heavier than any fear or shame. began to descend upon her. Her eyelids grew heavy. She watched the unmoving silhouette of the blacksmith at the window, the man whose bath she had fallen into, the stranger who had offered her a blanket and a place by his fire without a single question. Outside, the world was a howling chaos, a place of cruel men and violent storms. But in here, in this small, strange pocket of warmth and silence, she was, for the first time all night, safe. Her head drooped, and with the sound of the rain as her lullaby, she finally fell asleep. The first thing to pierce the thick blanket of Evelyn's exhaustion was not light, but sound. Clang! A deep, resonant ring that vibrated through the wooden chair and up her spine. It was slow, deliberate, a heartbeat of iron. Clang! Her eyes fluttered open. For a disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. The air was cool and tasted of cold ash. The wool blanket was still wrapped tightly around her shoulders. A coarse but comforting weight, sunlight pale and clean after the rain, streamed through the cabin's single window, illuminating a universe of swirling dust motes. The storm was over. Clang! The sound came from outside, pushing herself up, every muscle in her body protesting the night spent contorted in the chair. She crept to the open doorway. The world outside was washed new. The red earth was dark and damp, and the air held the clean, sharp scent of rain-soaked creosote. And there, in the wide-open workshop next to the cabin, was the source of the sound. It was him, Jack Callahan. He was a different man in the daylight, stripped to the waist, his back to her. He was a study in controlled power. The muscles in his shoulders and back knotted and flowed with each swing of the hammer, a rhythm of disciplined force. He was working a piece of glowing orange metal on the anvil, and with every strike, sparks flew like angry fireflies. He was not a man. He was a force of nature, as elemental as the fire in his forge and the iron under his hammer. He seemed utterly consumed by his work, a part of the noise and the heat and the hiss of cooling steel. She watched, mesmerized and terrified in equal measure, until he paused to quench the metal in a trough of water. A great cloud of steam billowed up, and in that moment, he turned. His eyes met hers across the damp yard. They were the same dark, unreadable eyes from the night before, but in the clear light of morning, she could see they were a deep, guarded gray, like a winter sky. He didn't smile. He didn't scowl. He simply acknowledged her presence with a slight, almost imperceptible dip of his chin. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of a sooty forearm, leaving a dark smudge. "There's coffee on the fire," he said, his voice the same low rumble as before, "and bread on the table." Then he turned back to the forge, plunging the metal back into the glowing coals. The conversation, it seemed, was over. Evelyn retreated back inside. A small tin pot was indeed sitting on a grate over the hearth's embers, and a half-loaf of dark, heavy bread sat on the simple wooden table. Her stomach twisted, a painful knot of hunger and shame. She felt like a stray dog he had taken pity on, a ghost haunting the edges of his solitary life. Her eyes fell upon the pathetic, mud-stained heap of white silk on the floor. Her wedding dress. The sight of it sent a fresh wave of humiliation through her, followed by a cold spike of fear. Harlan Morgan would be looking for her. The thought was a physical blow. She could picture it now, the fury in his eyes, the tightening of his cruel mouth. He was a man of immense pride, and she had wounded it in the most public way possible. He wouldn't see her as a frightened girl who had fled an unwanted fate. He would see her as his property, stolen and in need of retrieval. The whispers would already be slithering through Red Hollow. Morgan's girl vanished into the storm. Did she run off? Did someone take her? The townspeople would talk, some with pity, most with a salacious curiosity. Her reputation, the only currency a woman like her possessed, was already spent. She was trapped. She couldn't go back, and she couldn't stay here. This man, this silent blacksmith, had offered her shelter from the storm, but he couldn't shelter her from Morgan. A new resolve hardened within her. She would not be a useless burden. She would not be a ghost. She drank the bitter, black coffee and ate a piece of the dense bread, the food like stones in her stomach. Then she set to work. She found a broom made of bound twigs and swept the cabin's floor, gathering the dust and ash into a neat pile. She took the tin plates from the table to a bucket of water by the door and washed them clean. She found her dress, and holding it with a sense of revulsion, took it outside and hung it over a bush to dry in the sun, a tattered white flag of surrender. She felt his eyes on her as she worked, a heavy, silent observation. But he said nothing, the rhythm of his hammer never faltering. When she was done, there was nothing left to do. The cabin was painfully bare, the reflection of a man who owned little and wanted less. She sat back in the chair by the hearth, wrapping the blanket around her again, and the silence descended. It was a thick, oppressive thing, broken only by the clang of the hammer and the roar of the forge. Late in the afternoon, the hammering stopped. Jack entered the cabin, his body gleaming with sweat and streaked with soot. He moved past her without a word, taking a bucket of clean water and a rough cloth to the corner of the room, where he washed his face and torso with brisk, efficient movements. As he did, Evelyn's gaze fell upon his back. It was a canvas of old scars. A long, puckered line ran diagonally across his left shoulder blade, the kind left by a blade. Smaller, circular scars dotted his right side, pale and faded against his skin. These were the marks of a soldier, the marks of the war the whole country was still trying to forget. She remembered the whispers now, the stories she'd have heard in town. Callahan, the cavalrymen. They said he was brave, but that there was a shadow over his service. They said a lieutenant had died during a chaotic retreat, and that Callahan had been the last man with him. There was no proof, no trial, but the accusation clung to him like the smell of coal smoke. Killer. The word echoed in her memory, spoken by the town's most pious gossips. Looking at him now, at the quiet, contained way he moved, it seemed impossible. And yet, the scars were real. The silence was real. He pulled on a clean shirt, a worn and gray Henley with a tear in the sleeve. He looked at her, his expression unreadable as ever. Skies clear. He stated it was not a conversation starter, it was a fact. Evelyn understood the unspoken meaning. The storm is over. You can leave now. Panic flared in her chest. I can't, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Not yet. He studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes seeming to see right through her fear, to the shame and desperation beneath. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. You can stay till the road's dry, he said, amending his earlier decree. And that was that. He sat at the table and began to clean a rifle, his large hands surprisingly deft as he worked the oilcloth over the polished wood and blued steel. The days that followed fell into a strange, silent rhythm. Evelyn would wake to the sound of the hammer. She would tidy the cabin, fetch water from the well behind the workshop, and prepare a simple meal from his sparse larder, mostly beans, bacon, and the heavy bread he seemed to subsist on. One afternoon, finding a small box with a needle and thread, she took his torn shirt and mended the sleeve with small, neat stitches. When she left it folded on his cot, he said nothing, but the next morning he was wearing it. It was a conversation held in thread and cloth. He never asked her name. He never asked why she had been running through a storm in a wedding dress. He accepted her presence as he accepted the weather a temporary condition to be endured. In return, she never asked about his scars or the ghosts that seemed to haunt the edges of his silence. They were two solitary creatures occupying the same small space, their shared language an absence of words. His silence was a wall, built of stone and grief. Her silence was a refuge, a place where she didn't have to explain or justify her terror. The fear of Morgan was a constant companion, a cold knot in the pit of her stomach. Every time a horseman appeared on the distant horizon, she would shrink back into the shadows of the cabin, her heart pounding, until the rider passed. Jack would see her fear. His hammering would pause for a beat, and then resume, steady and reassuring. His presence, once a source of terror, was becoming an anchor. He was a rumored killer, a man set apart from the world, but in his quiet orbit, she felt a strange, fragile sense of security. On the third day, craving a respite from the cabin's smoky confines, Evelyn ventured a little farther than the well. The desert, revitalized by the rain, was showing faint signs of life. Tiny green shoots pushed through the damp earth, and in a sheltered patch between two sun-warmed rocks, she found it, a small bush of wild lavender, its slender purple flowers releasing a soft, clean fragrance into the air. The scent was a balm to her frayed nerves. It smelled of peace, of a world away from dust and iron and fear. On impulse, she broke off a small sprig. She held it in her hand all the way back to the cabin, the tiny, delicate blossoms a stark contrast to her calloused fingers. Inside, she looked for a place to put it. The cabin had no adornments, no softness. There were no vases, no jars. Her eyes fell on the wooden bathtub, now sitting empty and dry in the center of the room. It was the site of her deepest humiliation, the symbol of their bizarre first meeting. Carefully, reverently, she walked over and placed the sprig of lavender on the tub's wooden rim. It was a small, foolish gesture. The flower looked absurdly out of place in the stark, masculine space, but it was an offering, a silent apology for her intrusion, a wordless thank you for his shelter, a tiny speck of beauty offered to a man who lived without it. That evening, when Jack came in from the forge, he followed his usual routine. He stopped at the bucket to wash, his movements weary. As he turned to get a towel, he saw it. He stopped dead. He stood for a full minute, staring at the fragile purple sprig resting on the edge of his tub. His broad shoulders were tense, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Evelyn, watching from her chair by the fire, held her breath. She expected him to brush it away, to crush it in his hand, to discard her small offering as the meaningless weed it was. But he didn't. He simply looked at it, and for a fleeting instant, the hard mask of his face seemed to soften. A flicker of some unreadable emotion passed through his eyes: surprise, confusion, perhaps the ghost of a memory. The scent, faint but distinct, now mingled with the ever-present smells of his life: smoke, steel, and sweat. He eventually turned away, finishing his washing in his customary silence, but he left the lavender where it was. Later, as darkness fell and the coyotes began their lonely calls in the hills, they sat in their usual quiet. The fire cast a warm glow on the room. He was cleaning his tools. She was darning one of his socks. The silence between them was still vast, but it felt different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the unspoken words of mended shirts and shared bread, and now it was scented, ever so faintly, with the sweet, gentle fragrance of wild lavender. For the first time since she had fled her own life, Evelyn felt the tight knot of fear in her chest loosen, just a little. She was a girl without a name in the house of a man without a past, but for tonight, that was enough. The fragile peace, scented with lavender and forged in silence, was always meant to be temporary. It lasted a week of unspoken routines, of mended clothes and shared, simple meals. It was a week where Evelyn began to feel the rhythm of her own breathing again, slow and even, free from the frantic gasps of her flight. But their supplies dwindled, and the world beyond the cabin could not be ignored forever. It was Jack who broke the silence one morning, his voice a low rumble over the clang of his hammer. We need flour. Salt. He didn't look at her, his attention fixed on the horseshoe he was shaping. I can't go into Red Hollow. They watch me. The unspoken part hung in the air between them, but you can... Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in Evelyn's stomach. Red Hollow. The place was a web, and Harlan Morgan was the spider at its center. To go there was to walk knowingly into that web. But looking at Jack's stark profile, at the way he provided for her without question, she knew she couldn't refuse. It was her turn to contribute something other than mended socks. I'll go, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. He gave a single, sharp nod. The next hour was spent in preparation. He had her change out of her ruined wedding dress, which she had washed and kept out of a strange, morbid sentiment. He gave her a pair of boys' dungarees, worn soft with use, and a loose-fitting linen shirt. They were far too big, but with a rope for a belt and the sleeves rolled up, they served their purpose. He had her bind her long, honey-colored hair and tuck it under a dusty, wide-brimmed hat. Keep your head down, he instructed, his gray eyes serious as he handed her a small leather pouch with a few coins. Speak only when you have to. Get what we need from Miller's mercantile. He's the least likely to be in Morgan's pocket, and be back before noon. The walk to town was a penance, with every step that brought her closer to Red Hollow. The knot of fear in her stomach tightened. She kept to the arroyos and low ground, her eyes scanning the horizon. The town, when it came into view, looked exactly as she remembered, a handful of sun-bleached buildings clinging stubbornly to the dusty main street, a place of small lives and long memories. Miller's mercantile smelled of canvas, coffee beans, and chewing tobacco. Keeping the hat's brim low, she moved quickly, gathering the flour and salt. Mr. Miller, a balding man with kind, watery eyes, barely gave her a second glance. She paid with Jack's coins and turned to leave, a wave of relief washing over her. She had done it. And then, a voice cut through the quiet store. Well, I'll be, if it ain't one of the Moore girls. Evelyn froze, her hand on the door. It was Silas Croft, a neighboring rancher whose land bordered her father's. He was a weaselly man known for his gossiping tongue and for owing money to half the territory, including Harlan Morgan. His small, piggy eyes raked over her, a flicker of greedy recognition dawning in them. Thought you'd run clean out of the territory, he said, a sly grin spreading across his face. Mister, Morgan has been mighty concerned. Offered a handsome reward for any word of you. Evelyn didn't answer. She pushed the door open and fled, Silas Croft's knowing chuckle following her out into the street. She didn't run, but her walk back to the cabin was a frantic, stumbling march, her heart hammering against her ribs. The web had been disturbed. The spider knew where she was. She burst into the clearing, breathless, and found Jack sharpening an axe by the wood pile. The look on her face was all the explanation he needed. "Someone saw me?" she gasped out, the words tumbling over each other. "Silas Croft. He knows who I am. He mentioned a reward." Jack's face, usually a mask of stoicism, hardened into something bleak and dangerous. He set the axe down with a quiet thud and stared out in the direction of Red Hollow, his jaw tight. For a long time, he said nothing. The only sound was the wind whispering through the mesquite. "He'll go to Morgan," Jack said finally. It wasn't a question. "They'll be here. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but they'll come." That night, the silence in the cabin was different. It was no longer a comfortable quiet, but a tense, watchful stillness, heavy with impending violence. They sat by the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls, making the small space feel like a cage. It was Evelyn who broke it, her voice small. "Why don't you leave? You could be gone before they get here. I'm the one they want." Jack looked up from the fire, his eyes seeming to hold the reflection of 1,000 other fires, 1,000 other nights spent waiting. "Running doesn't solve a thing," he said, his voice low and rough. It just changes the scenery for the same damn problems. I learned that a long time ago." He fell silent again. But something had broken open. The wall he kept around himself had cracked. He picked up a small piece of wood and began to whittle at it with a sharp knife, the shavings falling to the floor. "The men who talk in town," he began, not looking at her. "The ones who call me a killer, they've got the story half right. I did kill a man. My lieutenant." Evelyn watched him, her hands clenched in her lap. "We were cut off during a raid," he continued, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, as if reciting a history that belonged to someone else. "Apaches. They had us pinned down. Lieutenant Davies. He caught a rifle ball in the gut. He was dying, slowly, screaming. He knew what they'd do to him if they took him alive. He begged me. He gave me an order. 'Don't let them take me, Callahan.' So I didn't." He paused, the knife still in his hands. "The relief column found me an hour later, sitting with his body. They saw a dead officer and a living private, drew their own conclusions, said I shot him in the back to save myself. It was easier than telling the truth. The Army doesn't like stories about soldiers putting their own out of their misery." The raw, unvarnished truth of it settled in the small cabin. It was a story of duty and desperation, twisted by cowards into a tale of murder. "But that's not why I left," Jack said, his voice growing quieter. "I could have fought the charge. I could have cleared my name. But I didn't care by then, because while I was gone, while I was following orders and fighting for a piece of land nobody really wanted, my wife was killed." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. "Wife." The word seemed alien in this place of solitude. "Her name was Sarah," he said, and the name was a wound he had just reopened. "We had a small homestead, not far from the border. While I was away, some border patrolmen came through, said they were looking for smugglers. It was a lie. They were just bullies with badges, shaking down settlers for anything they could take." "Sarah." She stood up to them. She wasn't afraid of men like that. He stopped, his knuckles white on the handle of the knife. "They struck her down. She hit her head on the stone hearth. When I got back, there was nothing left but a cold house and a fresh grave dug by a neighbor." He looked at Evelyn then, and for the first time, she saw the full depth of the abyss behind his eyes. It was a cavern of grief so profound it had swallowed him whole. "They told me it was an accident," he said, a bitter, hollow sound. "A woman who fell. Nothing to be done. The law protected its own. I learned then that there's no justice in this world. Not from men with badges or Bibles. You get what you can take. You protect what you can hold. And when you can't hold anything anymore, you walk away. So I did. I walked away from the Army. From the law. From everything. Came out here where the only thing I had to listen to was the wind." In his story, Evelyn heard the echo of her own. She saw the same raw injustice. Jack had been judged and condemned by a story told by others. His life and honor stripped from him. His wife, Sarah, had been treated as an inconvenience, her life disposable in the face of corrupt authority. And Evelyn herself had been treated as chattel, a piece of property to be sold to settle a debt, in his haunted gray eyes. She saw the same pain she felt in her own soul, the pain of being made powerless, of being reduced to less than human by the casual cruelty of others. "They didn't see the man you are," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "They just saw what they wanted to see." His gaze met hers across the firelight, and in that moment, a bridge of understanding formed across the chasm of their separate griefs. He was no longer just her protector, and she was no longer just a refugee. They were survivors. The next morning, the atmosphere had shifted. The threat was still there, but the despair had been replaced by a grim sense of purpose. "Morgan will come with men," Jack said as he drank his morning coffee. "You can't just hide." He took her out into the yard, from a wooden chest in the workshop. He produced an old Colt peacemaker, its weight heavy and menacing in her hands. "You need to know how to use this," he said simply. He showed her how to load it, how to cock the hammer, how to aim. Her hands trembled. She had lived around guns her whole life, but she had never held one with intent. The first time she pulled the trigger, the explosion was deafening, the recoil jarring her shoulder. The bullet went wide, kicking up dust 10 feet from the tin can he had set on a fence post. Again, was all he said. Day after day, they practiced. He was a patient, methodical teacher. He taught her to control her breathing, to squeeze the trigger, not jerk it. Slowly, her fear of the weapon was replaced by a grudging respect for it. It was not an instrument of malice. It was a tool, and it could be a tool for her survival. He also began to teach her about the land. He showed her how to read tracks in the dry earth, how to find water, how to build a shelter that was nearly invisible against a rock face. He was teaching her how to disappear. Her education in survival took an unexpected turn at the lean-to stable beside the workshop. There, Jack kept a single horse, a fine-boned black mare with a coat that shone like coal. But her left foreleg was wrapped in clean bandages, and she favored it heavily, her head drooping with pain. "What happened to her?" Evelyn asked, her heart going out to the beautiful, wounded animal. "Caught in a rock slide up in the canyons," Jack replied, changing the dressing with practiced hands. "Found her last month. Leg was torn up bad. Thought I might have to put her down." "What's her name?" Jack paused, smoothing the new bandage. "Mercy," he said quietly. It was a piece of her old life Evelyn could hold on to. She knew horses. She understood their silent language of trust and fear. She began to spend her afternoons with Mercy, speaking to her in low, soothing tones, brushing her dark coat until it gleamed, carefully cleaning the wound as Jack had shown her. The horse, at first skittish and wary, began to relax under her gentle care. She would nicker softly when Evelyn approached, leaning her great head against her shoulder. Jack watched from a distance. He saw the easy confidence she had around the animal, the innate skill in her hands. He saw the way the horse responded to her, a trust Mercy had not yet fully given to him. As the days passed, a remarkable thing began to happen. As Evelyn learned to stand her ground, to hold a weapon, to read the unforgiving land, Mercy began to heal. The limp lessened. The light returned to her dark, intelligent eyes. The mare's slow, steady recovery was a mirror to her own. Evelyn had arrived broken, a terrified girl in a ruined dress. Now, she was a woman learning to wield her own strength, to mend what was broken. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon in shades of orange and purple, Evelyn led Mercy on a short, slow walk around the yard. The mare's steps were almost even, her limp nearly gone. A sense of quiet triumph filled Evelyn's heart. She looked up and saw Jack standing in the doorway of the forge, the firelight behind him outlining his powerful frame. He wasn't watching the horse. He was watching her. And in his gaze, there was no pity, no distance. There was only a profound, quiet respect. The broken things in his world were beginning to heal. The quiet of the desert evening was a deceptive thing. It was not an absence of sound, but a tapestry woven from it the rhythmic chirping of crickets, the mournful call of a distant owl, the soft whisper of the wind moving through the sagebrush. Inside the cabin, the air was still and warm, filled with the scent of wood smoke and the faint, lingering fragrance of lavender. Evelyn was mending a split seam in one of the flour sacks, her stitches small and even. Jack was across the table, sighting down the barrel of his rifle, his movements economical and precise. The weeks of tense waiting had sharpened their senses. They had fallen into a rhythm not of peace, but of readiness. Every shadow seemed longer, every unexpected sound a potential threat. Yet, tonight, the desert felt calm, its familiar sounds a lulling reassurance. That was why the silence, when it came, was so terrifying. It happened in an instant. The crickets stopped, The owl went quiet. The wind itself seemed to hold its breath. It was an unnatural void, a dead space in the night symphony. Jack's head snapped up from the rifle, his eyes locking with Evelyn's. He didn't need to speak. He rose in one fluid motion, blowing out the oil lamp and plunging the cabin into near total darkness, leaving only the faint glow of the fire's embers. "Down," he whispered, his voice a low command. He pushed her gently but firmly toward the floor behind the heavy wooden table. He moved to the window, a dark silhouette against the star-dusted sky, his rifle held ready, and then they heard it, not the frantic gallop of a posse, but the slow, deliberate tread of multiple horses picking their way through the rocky terrain. It was the sound of men who knew they had arrived at their destination, the sound of predators closing in. A voice, slick with arrogance and venom, cut through the night. "Callahan, I know you're in there. I've come for what's mine." Harlan Morgan. The name fell like a stone in the pit of Evelyn's stomach. She flattened herself further against the packed earth floor. The Colt Jack had given her feeling cold and impossibly heavy where it was tucked into the rope belt of her dungarees. "Send out the girl, and I might be inclined to let you live," Morgan shouted, his voice closer now. "She is my property, and I don't take kindly to thieves." Jack remained silent, a statue of deadly patience at the window. He was waiting, listening, counting. Evelyn could hear the soft creak of saddle leather, the jingle of a bridle, the low chuckle of another man. There were several of them. "Have it your way," Morgan called out, his tone shifting from false civility to pure malice. "If you won't come out, we'll burn you out." A bright, hungry light suddenly bloomed outside, casting flickering, demonic shadows into the cabin. Evelyn risked a glance over the edge of the table. The workshop. Jack's forge. His anvil. His livelihood was engulfed in flames. A man on horseback, silhouetted against the blaze, had just thrown a torch onto its roof. The dry timber caught with a roar, the fire climbing into the night sky like a screeching orange beast. The heat was instantaneous, pressing against the thin walls of the cabin. Smoke, thick and acrid, began to snake through the cracks in the door. The cabin's next. Callahan," Morgan roared over the crackle of the inferno. They were trapped. The fire would either consume them or force them out into the open, into Morgan's guns. Jack made his decision in a fraction of a second. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice tight. Before Evelyn could protest, he kicked open the cabin door and disappeared into the chaotic scene of fire and shadow. From her vantage point, the world became a terrifying collage of disconnected images. The searing heat, the suffocating smoke, the silhouette of Jack, moving with a soldier's deadly grace, using the corner of the burning workshop for cover. The flash of his rifle spitting fire into the darkness, a man screaming and falling from his horse. Morgan's men returned fire, the night exploding with the deafening reports of their pistols. Bullets splintered the doorframe of the cabin, thudding into the log walls. Evelyn squeezed her eyes shut, her hands over her ears, her body trembling uncontrollably. This was a nightmare of sound and fury, a world of violence she had only ever imagined. She forced herself to look again. Jack was holding his own, his rifle a steady, lethal presence in the chaos. He was outnumbered, but he was smarter, faster. He moved from cover to cover, a ghost in the firelight. Another of Morgan's men went down, clutching his leg. Then she saw Morgan. He was dismounted, using a horse for cover, directing his men. He was calm, his face a mask of cold fury in the firelight. He wasn't fighting, he was commanding, a general in his own petty war. Jack was reloading behind the stone well when a third man, unseen by him, circled around the burning structure. He stepped out of the shadows, his pistol raised. "Jack!" Evelyn screamed, the name tearing from her throat. Jack spun, but it was too late. The man's gun flashed. The sound was flat, ugly. Jack cried out, a sharp, guttural sound of pain, and staggered back, clutching his side. His rifle slipped from his grasp, clattering against the stones. He was hit. He was vulnerable. The world seemed to slow down. The man who had shot him began to advance, a triumphant sneer on his face. Morgan stepped out from behind his horse, his own pistol drawn, walking toward the wounded, half-crouched figure of Jack. This was it. They were going to kill him. And then they would take her. Something inside Evelyn snapped. The terror was still there, a shrieking thing in her mind. But something else rose to meet it, the memory of Jack's quiet kindness, the image of his scarred back, the sound of his voice telling her Sarah's story. He had shielded her. He had taught her. He had treated her not as property, but as a person. She would not let him die. Her hand, shaking so badly she could barely control it, closed around the grip of the Colt. It felt like lifting a boulder. She remembered his words, a calm island in the storm of her panic. Control your breathing. Squeeze. Don't jerk. She rose from behind the table, a small, trembling figure in the doorway of the cabin. The smoke stung her eyes. The heat was a physical blow. Morgan and his men were focused on Jack, just yards away. They hadn't seen her yet. She lifted the heavy revolver with both hands, the barrel shaking wildly. She couldn't hit a man. She knew she couldn't. But Jack's lessons hadn't just been about hitting a target. They had been about creating an opportunity. There was an oil lantern hanging from a post near the well, its light pale in comparison to the raging fire. She centered the wavering sight on it. She took a ragged breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The explosion was immense, a cannon blast next to her ear. The gun kicked back hard, bruising her hands. For a second, she thought she had missed. Then, with a tinkling crash, the lantern exploded in a shower of glass and burning oil. The small pool of light they had been standing in was instantly extinguished, plunging that part of the yard into disorienting darkness. The two men, startled by the unexpected shot from a new direction, spun around, momentarily blinded and confused. It was the only chance they would get. Jack seized it, even wounded. He moved with breathtaking speed. He launched himself forward, not at the men, but at Evelyn. He grabbed her arm, his grip like iron, and pulled her out of the cabin and into the darkness behind it. "Run!" he hissed, his breath coming in ragged pants. They scrambled away from the fire and the shouting, heading for the lean-to where Mercy was screaming in terror. The horse was wild-eyed, pulling at her tether. There was no time to saddle her. Jack ripped the rope free, vaulted onto her bare back with a grunt of pain, and reached down for Evelyn. He hauled her up to sit in front of him, her back pressed against his chest. "Go!" he yelled, kicking his heels into the mare's sides. Mercy, healed and strong, leaped forward into the night. They crashed through the underbrush, away from the chaos, with Morgan's enraged shouts and a few stray, panicked gunshots echoing behind them. Evelyn clung to the horse's mane, the wind tearing at her hair. Behind her, she could feel Jack slumped forward, his body heavy against hers. She could feel something else, too, a warm, wet stickiness seeping through her shirt, his blood. He guided her with muttered words, his voice growing weaker. The hills, painted hills, follow the dry creek bed. It was a nightmare ride through a labyrinth of rock and shadow. Mercy, sure-footed and fleet, seemed to understand the urgency, picking her way through the treacherous terrain. Jack was a dead weight now, his consciousness fading. It was Evelyn who held the reins, Evelyn who urged the horse on, her own terror a distant thing, replaced by a single, desperate focus escape. Hours seemed to pass, finally, under a towering cliff face that loomed like a giant's jaw. Jack stirred. "Here," he rasped, pointing a shaky finger at a dark fissure in the rock, almost completely hidden by a thick growth of scrub oak. "In here." She slid off Mercy's back, her legs buckling under her. She helped Jack dismount, his entire weight leaning on her small frame. He stumbled into the narrow opening, collapsing onto the sandy floor of a small, hidden cave. The adrenaline fled, leaving Evelyn shaking and hollow. In the pre-dawn gloom, she could see how bad it was. His shirt was soaked with blood, a dark, spreading stain on his left side. His face was pale as death, his breathing shallow. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to reclaim her, but she pushed it down. He had saved her. Now it was her turn. Working on pure instinct, she tethered Mercy out of sight in the scrub oaks. She found their canteen, thankfully still slung over Jack's shoulder. She needed bandages. Without hesitation, she ripped a long strip from the hem of the shirt he had given her. It wasn't enough. She tore another from her own. Her hands were trembling so violently she could barely work. She gently pulled his bloody shirt away from the wound. It was a ragged, ugly tear in the flesh just above his hip. It was bleeding sluggishly, but it was deep. She needed to clean it. She looked around desperately, in the pocket of her dungarees. Her fingers brushed against a small, wadded-up piece of cloth. It was the kerchief she'd used to carry the lavender. Days ago, it was all she had. She uncapped the canteen, poured a little of their precious water onto the cloth, and brought it to his wound. As the water hit the fabric, a ghostly, impossibly gentle scent rose from it, lavender, the scent of their brief, quiet life, now mingled with the stark, metallic smell of his blood. She pressed the cloth to the wound to stanch the bleeding, her touch as gentle as she could make it. Jack flinched, a low groan escaping his lips. His eyes opened, unfocused, and tried to find her in the darkness. "Evelyn," he breathed, her name a question, a plea. "I'm here, Jack," she whispered, her voice choked with tears she refused to let fall. "I'm here. Just be still." For the first time since she had crashed into his life, the self-sufficient, solitary man was utterly helpless. He lay on the cold stone, his life in her shaking hands. The girl who had run from a wedding, who had been afraid of her own shadow, was now the one fighting to keep the darkness at bay. She held the makeshift bandage against his side, her small form shielding him from the cold. As they waited for a dawn they were not yet certain he would live to see. The darkness in the cave was absolute, a thick, smothering blanket that swallowed sound and light. It was a living thing, broken only by the ragged, shallow breaths of the man lying on the cold stone floor. The night outside had been their salvation, a cloak for their escape, but here in the belly of the rock, it became their prison. Evelyn sat beside Jack, her back pressed against the unyielding wall, her senses strained to their breaking point. Every pained groan from him was a physical blow, every shiver that racked his body a tremor in her own. She had done all she could. The wound was bound tightly with strips of their own clothing. The bleeding slowed to a sluggish ooze. But a new enemy had arrived, one she couldn't fight with a gun or her wits. It crept in with the cold, a fever that started as a subtle chill and was now tightening its grip, turning his skin from clammy to fiery hot. The heat radiating from him was a stark contrast to the cave's damp chill. He began to mutter, his words slurred and fragmented, ghosts of a past she could only glimpse. "Hold the line, steady. Men, the river." They were the broken commands of a soldier, echoes from a life of discipline and violence. She listened, her heart aching, as his mind wandered through the battlefields of his memory. But then the landscape of his delirium shifted. The battlefield faded, replaced by a place of quiet desperation. "Sarah," he rasped, the name a raw, broken thing. "The well! Check the well!" Evelyn flinched as if struck. Hearing him speak his dead wife's name was an intimacy she had no right to witness, a violation of a grief so private it felt sacred. She wanted to cover her ears, to shut out the sound of a love that was not hers, but she was anchored to him by duty and a terrifying, burgeoning affection. "The fence needs mending, Sarah," he mumbled, his head thrashing against the rock floor. Before the rains come, his hands, clenched into fists, reached out for someone who wasn't there. I'm sorry. I should have been there. I'm so sorry. His fevered apologies were a torment. He was lost in a world she could not enter, a world where the woman he loved still lived, a world where his greatest failure was a broken fence, not a cold grave. Evelyn felt a pang of an emotion so complex she couldn't name it. It was a bitter cocktail of pity for his profound loss and a strange, sharp jealousy of a ghost. She was a phantom in his present, while Sarah was vividly, painfully alive in his past. She had to do something, anything to pull him back from the edge, to quiet the demons that the fever had unleashed. Desperate, she rummaged through the small leather satchel he'd had slung over his shoulder during their escape. Inside, beneath a spare box of cartridges and a whetstone, her fingers found a small, hard-covered book. She pulled it out. It was a pocket Bible, its black leather cover worn smooth and soft with time, the gold leaf on its spine all but faded away. She opened it carefully. On the inside cover, in elegant feminine script, was a name Sarah Callahan. Beneath it, a date from 6 years prior. This was his wife's Bible, the last piece of her he had left. Evelyn was not a pious woman. Her faith was like the desert itself, a vast, often harsh reality where one prayed more for rain than for salvation. But holding the worn book, she felt its weight as a tangible piece of comfort. It was all she had to offer. Her fingers, clumsy in the dark, found their way to the Psalms. She didn't know why, but they felt right. They were the songs of the lost and the frightened, the words of men who had known suffering. She angled the book to catch the faintest sliver of moonlight filtering through the crack in the cave entrance and began to read, her voice a low, trembling murmur. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want," she began, the ancient words feeling foreign and powerful on her tongue. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." Jack's thrashing seemed to lessen. The sound of her voice, a steady, quiet current in the turbulent ocean of his delirium, seemed to be reaching him in some deep, inaccessible place. She kept reading, her voice growing stronger, more certain. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." Hour after hour, she read. Her throat grew raw. Her eyes burned from straining in the dark. But she did not stop. She read of hope and endurance, of faith in the face of despair. The words were a lifeline, not just for him, but for her. They filled the oppressive silence, building a small fortress of sound against the encroaching darkness. She was no longer just a frightened girl hiding in a cave. She was a keeper of a vigil, a guardian of a flickering flame. The fever peaked just before dawn, in the darkest, coldest hour of the night. Jack's body went rigid, a violent tremor shaking his entire frame. His breathing became a frightening, shallow hitch in his chest. A choked, desperate sound escaped his lips. This was it. She was losing him. "No," she whispered, a fierce, protective instinct rising up. "No, you don't." She scrambled for the canteen, unscrewing the cap with shaking hands. She poured the last of their water onto the lavender-scented kerchief, the fabric now stiff with his dried blood. She bathed his face, his neck, his wrists, whispering his name over and over again, as if her voice alone could tether him to the world of the living. "Stay with me, Jack, stay with me." For a long, terrifying time, he did not respond. He lay unnaturally still, the fire within him seemingly having consumed everything. Evelyn slumped beside him, utterly spent, a cold, hard knot of despair tightening in her chest. She had failed. And then a single shuddering breath. He began to shiver, but it was different now. It was not the rigid, burning tremor of the fever's peak, but a deep, racking chill, as if his body were expelling the last of the heat. The unnatural fire was receding. His breathing, though still ragged, began to deepen, to even out. Exhausted, she laid her head on his chest, feeling the slow, steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. It was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. The fever had broken. The long, desperate night was ending. He woke with the first light of dawn. He didn't startle, but returned to the world slowly, his eyes fluttering open to a reality of pain and weakness. He looked around the small cave, his gaze hazy and confused, before it finally settled on her. She was huddled beside him, her face pale and smudged with dirt, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He tried to sit up, a sharp groan of pain stopping him. "What?" he began, his voice a dry, cracked whisper. "The fever broke," she said softly. "You've been unwell." He sank back, his eyes closing for a moment as memory returned in a painful flood. The fire, the escape, the ride. He remembered flashes of the night, disjointed and surreal, the feeling of falling into a deep, dark well, and a voice, a soft, steady voice, reading words he hadn't heard in years. He also remembered dreaming of Sarah. He remembered calling her name. A deep, burning shame washed over him. "You heard me," he rasped, unable to meet her eyes. Evelyn knew what he meant. She knew he was not just talking about the feverish ramblings of a soldier, but the intimate cries for his lost wife. He felt exposed, his deepest grief laid bare before this near stranger. He was the strong one, the protector. Now he was nothing but a broken man, full of ghosts. She reached out, her cool hand resting gently on his forehead. A gesture of simple, profound comfort. "I heard a man in pain," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "I heard a man who loved his wife. I heard a good man, haunted by things he couldn't control." He finally looked at her, his gray eyes clouded with guilt and confusion. "They call me a killer, Evelyn. I took a man's life." "I know your story," she replied softly. "That's not the man I see." She leaned closer, her gaze so direct, so honest, that he could not look away. "What they say in town, the stories they tell, that's just noise. It has nothing to do with you. You're not a sinner. Jack, I see you, the man who gave me shelter, the man who taught me to be strong, the man who fought for me. I see you, not the man they talk about." Her words were simple, but they landed with the force of a revelation. In his entire life since the war, no one had ever offered him such unconditional absolution. The world had branded him, judged him, and cast him out. He had accepted their verdict, building a fortress of solitude around his guilt and grief. And now, this young woman, whose life he had inadvertently shattered, was looking at him and seeing not a killer, not a failure, but simply him. It was a pardon he never knew he needed, a grace that was both humbling and profoundly healing. At that exact moment, the sun crested the peaks of the painted hills. A single, brilliant shaft of golden light pierced the gloom of the cave through the fissure in the rock above. It cut through the darkness, illuminating the swirling dust motes like 1,000 tiny stars. The beam fell across their faces, warming their skin, chasing away the last of the night's chill. It lit the tear tracks on Evelyn's exhausted face and the dawning wonder in Jack's. It was the light of a new day, a new beginning. The fever was gone. The ghosts, for the first time in a long time, were silent. Two broken souls, huddled together in the heart of a mountain, had found a fragile, sacred redemption not in the words of a holy book, but in the simple, unwavering faith of each other. They had survived. The news came to them like a stray whisper on the wind, carried by a traveling preacher who had lost his way in the painted hills and stumbled upon their hidden cave. Harlan Morgan was dead. The preacher, a gaunt man with frightened eyes, didn't know the full story, only the version that had already hardened into Red Hollow legend. Morgan and his men had returned from their raid on the blacksmith's forge, empty-handed and furious. There had been an argument, fueled by whiskey and greed, likely over the reward money Morgan had refused to pay for a failed venture. A gun was drawn, then another. When the smoke cleared, Harlan Morgan lay dead in the dust of the main street, killed not by the man he was hunting, but by the loyalty he had tried to buy. Silas Croft, the man who had recognized Evelyn, was also among the dead. The law, in its own brutal, indifferent way, had tidied up the mess. The immediate threat was gone. But returning to Red Hollow was a journey into a different kind of unknown. They were no longer just a blacksmith and a runaway. They were the central figures in a violent town drama. They rode back not in triumph, but in a quiet, somber procession of two. Mercy's steady gait the only sound in the vast silence. What they returned to was a scar on the land. The forge was a skeleton of blackened timbers and ash. The anvil, the heart of Jack's existence, stood alone and soot-stained amidst the debris, a monument to the life that had been burned away. The cabin, miraculously, was untouched, save for a few stray bullet holes in the walls. For a moment, they just stood there, surveying the ruin. Evelyn expected to see despair on Jack's face, the same hollow grief he had carried for his wife. But instead, she saw a flicker of something she had never seen before, a quiet, steely resolve. He looked from the ashes of his forge to her, and his gaze was not that of a man who had lost everything, but of a man who had just remembered what was worth fighting for. "I'll need an axe," was all he said. And so, the rebuilding began. It was slow, arduous work, a battle fought not with guns but with sweat and determination. They cleared the debris, hauling away the charred wood and twisted metal. Jack, with an expertise that fascinated Evelyn, selected new timber from the sparse woods along the creek bed, felling trees with the same focused power he used to swing his hammer. He taught her how to notch the logs, how to fit them together, her hands growing calloused and strong alongside his. The town watched, at first, from a distance, with suspicion and morbid curiosity. They saw the rumored killer and the runaway girl working from sunup to sundown, their movements falling into a seamless rhythm. They saw them raise the new walls of the forge, beam by beam. They heard the sound of sawing and hammering, the sounds of life returning to a place they had long considered dead. Slowly, the town's narrative began to shift. They had seen Morgan's cruelty firsthand. They had heard the whispers of how Evelyn's father had all but sold her. They saw Jack Callahan, not as a brooding recluse, but as a man defending his home. And they saw Evelyn, not as a disgraced girl, but as a woman of quiet strength, standing by his side. A few of the braver townsfolk started to leave small offerings at the edge of the property: a sack of potatoes, a jar of preserves, a length of rope. They were silent apologies, acknowledgments of a misjudgment. Jack and Evelyn would find them in the morning and accept them with a silent nod in the direction of the town. Their own silence had changed. Too, it was no longer a space between two solitudes, but a shared language. They moved around each other with an unspoken understanding, an intimacy forged in a cave and now tempered in the desert sun. He would know she needed a tool before she asked, placing it in her hand. She would bring him a dipper of cool water before he realized his own thirst, her fingers brushing his as he took it. They were partners in a way that went deeper than words, two halves of a single, determined effort. The days bled into weeks. Summer's fierce heat softened into the golden light of early autumn. The forge was nearly complete, its new timber walls smelling of fresh-cut pine and hope. The great leather bellows were repaired, the tools cleaned and arranged, and the anvil was back in its rightful place, ready to ring again. It was the end of one such day, a day that had been particularly grueling. They had spent it wrestling the heavy forge hood back into place, a job that strained every muscle and sinew. Jack was covered in a thick layer of soot, sweat, and grime, his hair matted to his forehead. He stood in the doorway of the newly finished structure, his hands on his hips, a deep weariness in his bones. but a profound satisfaction in his eyes. While he was banking the fire for the night, Evelyn slipped back to the cabin. A quiet resolve had settled over her. Tonight, she would not be the recipient of his care, but the giver. She worked with a silent, deliberate purpose. She hauled bucket after bucket of water from the well, her arms aching, and set them to heat over the hearth, the old wooden bathtub, the one that had been the stage for their chaotic first meeting. She dragged to the center of the cabin floor. When the water was steaming, she poured it in, the rising clouds of steam filling the small room with a humid, clean warmth. She added a sliver of the pine soap he favored, its sharp, resinous scent perfuming the air. She was recreating a memory, but this time it would be different. There would be no accident, no fear, no shame. This would be a choice. Jack entered the cabin, his shoulders slumped with fatigue. He stopped dead in the doorway, his eyes taking in the scene, the steaming tub, the waiting towel laid out neatly on the chair, and Evelyn, standing by the hearth, her face softly illuminated by the firelight. He looked at her, his gray eyes full of a question he didn't know how to ask. She offered him a small, gentle smile. It was all the invitation he needed. There was a profound vulnerability in the moment. He, the strong one, the protector, was being offered a gift of pure comfort. He slowly unlaced his work boots, his movements stiff with exhaustion. He stripped off his filthy clothes, his back to her, and this time there was no awkwardness, only a simple, trusting acceptance. He stepped into the hot water with a long, heartfelt sigh, the weariness of 100 hard days seeming to dissolve into the steam. Evelyn turned away, giving him his privacy, but the air was charged with a new, unspoken intimacy. The roles were now completely reversed. He was the one being cleansed, and she was the one providing the sanctuary. After a few minutes, when the sounds of splashing had subsided to a contented quiet, she turned back. He was leaning his head back against the tub's rim, his eyes closed, the tension gone from his face. She walked over, and with a hand that was now steady and sure, she did one more thing. From a small jar on the mantelpiece, she took a sprig of wild lavender she had picked that morning. She gently placed it on the wooden rim of the tub, right beside his hand. The delicate, sweet scent rose with the steam, cutting through the sharp smell of pine. It was the scent of their vigil in the cave, the scent of her first small offering of peace, the scent of her. His eyes opened. He looked at the fragile purple flower resting on the dark, wet wood. He lifted his hand, his rough blacksmith's fingers, calloused and stained with work, touching the delicate blossoms with an almost reverent gentleness. He looked up at her, and in that moment, the last wall around his heart crumbled into dust. He saw it all with a blinding clarity. The first time, she had fallen into his life by mistake. A chaotic, terrified angel crashing into his solitude. He had found her in his bath, a shocking intrusion that had somehow woken him from a long, dead sleep. Tonight, she had brought the bath to him. She had prepared it, a deliberate, tender act of love and care. The scent was the thread that tied the two moments together, transforming a memory of startling chaos into a symbol of quiet, profound salvation. She was not Sarah. She was not a ghost from his past or a replacement for his grief. She was Evelyn, the woman who had seen him, the true him, and had chosen to stay. The woman who had saved his life with a trembling hand and a steady voice. The woman who was now offering him a new life, one clean sprig of lavender at a time. His voice, when he spoke, was low and thick with an emotion that transcended years of solitude and loss. He looked directly into her eyes, and the entire world seemed to shrink to the space between them. "That scent," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I found it once, and I'll never lose it again." He was not just talking about the lavender. Evelyn's breath hitched. She understood the depth of his vow. The meaning behind the simple words, "I found you once, by accident. Now, I have found you again, by choice, and I will choose you forever." A tear she hadn't realized she was holding slipped down her cheek, but she was smiling. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. The bathing was no longer about washing away the grime of the day. It was a baptism, a cleansing of two wounded souls, washing away the blood and the ash and the grief, leaving only a clean, new beginning, and the sweetest scent either of them had ever known. The morning after the bath, the world felt fundamentally altered. The sun rose on the same stark landscape. The air was still dry and thin, but the silence between them was no longer a space to be carefully navigated. It was a shared comfort, a soft blanket woven from trust. When Jack's hammer began to ring from the newly built forge, the sound was different. It was not the solitary, angry clang of a man beating back his ghosts. It was a steady, resonant rhythm, a heartbeat. Life, however, could not be lived entirely in their small clearing. They needed supplies, and the town of Red Hollow, which had been a place of fear and judgment, was now a necessity. Their first trip back was a silent, tense affair. They rode in on Mercy, Jack in front, Evelyn sitting behind him, her hands resting lightly on his waist. As they entered the main street, a hush fell over the town. Windows fluttered with curious faces. Men stopped their conversations to stare. It was the stare of a town witnessing the return of its own myth. Their first stop was Miller's Mercantile. Mr. Miller, who had once barely acknowledged Evelyn, now looked at Jack with a mixture of fear and awe. He looked at Evelyn with a new, profound respect. He served them quickly, his hands trembling slightly as he measured out flour and coffee beans. As they were leaving, his wife, a stout woman who had always been a font of town gossip, stepped forward. She didn't speak to Jack. She looked directly at Evelyn. "Your stitching on that boy's shirt was very fine," she said, her voice quiet but clear enough for the whole store to hear. "My youngest tore her Sunday dress. A bad rip. I'd be willing to pay you to fix it." It was an offering. More than a business proposition, it was a bridge. A woman reaching out to another woman, bypassing the complicated histories of the men around them. "I'd be glad to," Evelyn replied, her voice steady. That simple exchange was the first crack in the wall between them and Red Hollow. Evelyn mended the dress with stitches so fine the tear was nearly invisible. Mrs. Miller paid her fairly and, more importantly, showed the work to her neighbors. Soon, other women began to arrive at the cabin, bringing torn shirts, ripped dungarees, and dresses needing alterations. They would come with their mending and stay for a few minutes of quiet conversation, their initial apprehension slowly dissolving in the face of Evelyn's gentle competence. She set up a small workspace in a corner of the cabin, with a chair, a basket for her threads, and a clear view of the forge. She had found a purpose that was entirely her own, a way to contribute that was separate from Jack but parallel to him. She was no longer the runaway girl or the blacksmith's woman. She was Evelyn Moore, the seamstress. Jack's integration was a harder, slower process. The men of the town still regarded him with a wary distance. They saw the man who had faced down Harlan Morgan, who had survived a fire and a gunfight. They respected his strength, but they still feared his past. The turning point came a month later, with a frantic rider from the Cross T Ranch. One of their best cutting horses had gotten tangled in barbed wire, its leg laid open to the bone. They were about to put the animal down. In desperation, the rancher had remembered the stories about Callahan being a cavalryman. Jack went without hesitation. Evelyn watched him ride out, his bag of tools and a roll of clean linen strapped to Mercy's saddle. He returned late that night, bone-weary and covered in blood that was not his own. He didn't speak of what happened, but the rancher did. He told everyone in the saloon how Callahan had worked with a surgeon's calm, cleaning the wound, stitching the muscle and skin with a blacksmith's strong, steady hand, and setting the bone in a splint made from a barrel stave. He had saved a horse worth more than most men's homes. After that, they started coming, not for conversation, but for help. A cow with a difficult birth, a mule that had thrown a shoe and gone lame, a man with a deep axe wound in his arm from a wood-cutting accident. Jack never claimed to be a doctor, but his knowledge, gleaned from bloody battlefields and years of practical experience, was invaluable. He would clean and stitch wounds, set simple fractures, and offer tinctures made from desert plants he knew had healing properties. He never asked for payment, but sacks of grain, sides of bacon, and tools he needed for the forge would appear at his doorstep. The sound of his hammer became the new pulse of Red Hollow. It was the first thing people heard in the morning and the last thing they heard as dusk fell. It was no longer a sound of isolation. It was the sound of creation, of reliability. It was the sound of a man mending not just iron, but the broken pieces of a community. The forge, once a place of solitary labor, was now often surrounded by men waiting for a repair, sharing a bit of news or a plug of tobacco. They still didn't speak of the past. They didn't need to. The present was being hammered into a new shape on Jack's anvil. One afternoon, as Evelyn sat sewing by the cabin window, she watched him at work. He was shoeing a horse for a farmer, his movements a dance of power and grace. The farmer's young son, a boy of about 6, stood nearby, watching with wide-eyed fascination. Jack, noticing the boy's attention, paused in his work. He took a small scrap of iron, heated it in the forge until it glowed a brilliant orange, and with a few deft taps of his hammer, shaped it into a tiny, perfect horseshoe. He quenched it in the water trough and handed the still warm piece of metal to the boy. The child's face lit up with a joy so pure it made Evelyn's heart ache. In that small, simple act, she saw the final healing of Jack Callahan. He was no longer just a survivor, but a creator. He was not just mending tools, he was forging connections, building a future from the scraps of the past. Their life together settled into a quiet, beautiful rhythm. They worked side by side during the day, he in the forge, she in the cabin. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes reading, often just existing in a comfortable silence that was more profound than any conversation. He would sometimes reach out and take her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers, a simple, grounding gesture that said everything that needed to be said. He had found his scent, and he was never letting it go. The cabin began to change. Evelyn added curtains to the window, sewn from a bolt of cheerful calico. A colorful rag rug covered the spot where her ruined wedding dress had once lain. He built her a proper sewing table and a set of shelves for her supplies. He built them a real bed, wide enough for 2, its headboard smooth and sturdy against their backs. It was no longer just his shelter. It was their home. One evening, Mr. Miller gave Evelyn an old, unused ledger from the mercantile, its pages clean and empty. That night, after Jack had fallen asleep, his steady breathing a comforting presence beside her, Evelyn lit a small lamp. She opened the ledger, dipped a pen in a pot of ink, and began to write. She wrote about the dust storm, about falling into the bath, about the fear and the silence. She wrote about the fire, the cave, and the fever. She wrote about the sound of his hammer, the feel of his hand in hers, and the way the light fell across his face when he smiled. A rare and precious sight. She was not just recording events. She was trying to make sense of the impossible, beautiful, terrifying journey that had brought her here. She was charting the course of her own rebirth. She looked around the small, warm cabin, at the man sleeping peacefully beside her. She looked out the window at the new forge, its dark shape solid and reassuring under the vast, starry sky. The fire that Morgan had set was meant to be an ending, an act of total destruction, but it hadn't been. It had been a beginning. It had burned away the past, clearing the ground for something new and stronger to grow. She dipped her pen in the ink again, the steady clang, clang, clang of Jack's hammer from that afternoon still echoing in her memory. The sound was not a ghost of the fire, it was a promise. She put pen to paper and wrote the words that had been forming in her heart for weeks, a truth forged in ash and grace. "We build not to forget the fire," she wrote, her script clear and steady, but to remind ourselves that we survived it. The autumn air had a new crispness to it, a clean edge that the brutal summer sun had scorched away. It carried the scent of dry leaves and distant wood smoke, a fragrance of endings and of rest. The ringing of Jack's hammer, which had for so long been the defining sound of their world, now had a new rhythm. It was a punctuation mark, not a constant sentence. It began with the sun and ended in the late afternoon, followed by a profound, earned silence that was deeper and more peaceful than any quiet Evelyn had ever known. This evening, that silence had just fallen. Jack emerged from the forge, wiping his hands on a rag. The fire was banked, the tools were cleaned and put away. He moved with the unhurried grace of a man whose work was done and done well. Evelyn met him at the cabin door with a dipper of cool water, a ritual as ingrained as the sunset itself. He drank deeply, his eyes meeting hers over the rim. The question was there, unspoken. "Are you ready?" She answered with a simple nod. They didn't walk often, not without purpose, but in the last few weeks, an evening walk to the slow-moving river that bordered the far edge of his property had become their own quiet ceremony. It was a way of marking the transition from a day of labor to a night of peace, a way of washing off the dust and noise in the gentle currents of the twilight air. They walked side by side, their shoulders occasionally brushing. They didn't need to hold hands. Their closeness was a palpable thing, an atmosphere that moved with them. The path was well worn now, a faint track their own feet had made through the sagebrush and creosote. Evelyn noticed the subtle changes in the landscape with a proprietary fondness. The cottonwoods along the riverbank were a blaze of brilliant yellow, their leaves trembling like 1,000 gold coins in the breeze. A hawk circled high overhead, a lonely sentinel against a sky that was fading from a deep, impossible blue to a soft, bruised purple at the eastern horizon. This land, which had once been a terrifying, alien wilderness to her, was now home. Its language was no longer one of threat, but of familiarity. She knew the call of the quail, the shape of the rocks, the scent of the earth after a rare rain. They reached the river's edge and stopped at their usual spot, a collection of large, smooth stones warmed by the last of the day's sun. The river was low this time of year, its summer urgency gone. It moved with a slow, meandering grace, its surface a perfect, unbroken mirror reflecting the vast, open sky. As the sun sank below the distant hills, the light it cast back was not gold or orange, but a liquid, shimmering silver. It was as if the river were hoarding the last of the light, transforming it into something precious. They sat, not speaking, simply watching the day die. The silence was a comfortable weight, a shared space where words were unnecessary. Evelyn's mind drifted back, as it often did in these quiet moments. She thought of the girl she had been, running in terror through a storm, her world shattered, her future a terrifying blank. It felt like a lifetime ago, a story about someone else. The shame and fear that had been her constant companions had long since faded, replaced by a quiet, resilient strength she had never known she possessed. She had learned that survival was not just about endurance. It was about the slow, patient work of rebuilding. Jack sat beside her, his powerful frame relaxed, his gaze fixed on the water. She wondered what he saw. Did he see the memory of a chaotic retreat, a place of violence and loss, or did he, like her, now see only peace? He had changed so much from the silent, haunted man she had first met. The wall of solitude he had built around himself had not been shattered, but dismantled. stone by patient stone. Laughter came to him more easily now, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to start deep in his chest. The ghosts in his eyes had not vanished entirely, but they had retreated, making room for a new light, a warmth that was reserved only for her. Reaching into the small cloth pouch she now carried at her belt, Evelyn pulled out a sprig of dried lavender. It was from the same hardy bush she had found all those months ago, its fragrance now a permanent part of their home, their clothes, their lives. The tiny purple blossoms were faded but still held their sweet, clean scent, a preserved memory of a desperate offering that had become a foundation. With a simple, unself-conscious gesture, she tucked the sprig into the knot of honey-colored hair at the nape of her neck. It was not an act of vanity, but of identity. The lavender was her story. It was their story. Jack turned his head. Watching her, he had seen her do this before. But tonight, in the ethereal silver light, the simple act seemed to hold the weight of their entire journey. He watched her profile, the curve of her cheek, the quiet strength in the set of her jaw. She was no longer a fragile thing the storm had washed in, but a woman who had weathered a storm of her own and had emerged, not unscathed, but whole. She had brought scent and color and life back into his monochrome world. She had been the mistake that had corrected the entire course of his life. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, barely more than a murmur, so as not to disturb the profound stillness of the evening. The river carried you to me by mistake. He wasn't talking about this river, the one flowing silver at their feet. He was talking about the other one, the river of rain and circumstance, the violent current of fate that had swept her from her old life and deposited her, terrified and dripping, into his. It was a simple statement of fact, an acknowledgement of the sheer, impossible chance that had brought them together. Evelyn turned to look at him, a slow, gentle smile spreading across her face. The truth in his words resonated deep within her soul. Everything in her life before that night had been planned, arranged, a path laid out for her by others that was leading her toward a quiet, certain doom. The only sensible thing to do had been to follow it. Running had been madness, an act of pure, illogical desperation, a mistake. But that single mistake had been the beginning of her real life. It had led her to this man, to this place, to this peace. It had led her to herself. Her smile widened, and her eyes, reflecting the last of the silver light, shone with a love that was as deep and steady as the river itself. That mistake, she said softly, was the only thing that ever made sense. His hand found hers, his fingers lacing through her own. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, a silent affirmation, a promise that needed no words. They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped, as the last of the silver light faded from the water and the first stars began to prick the deep velvet of the sky. The air grew cool, and the sounds of the desert night rose around them, the chirping of crickets, the distant call of a hunting coyote. The sounds were no longer menacing, but were now the familiar, comforting lullaby of home. Eventually, they rose and began the walk back to the cabin. In the distance, a warm, golden light shone from its single window, a beacon in the vast, beautiful darkness. It was their light, their home, their future, built by hand and forged not in fire, but in a simple, profound mistake that had turned out to be the truest form of grace. The scent of lavender, faint on the autumn air, walked with them, a sweet, unspoken promise that would last forever. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you are tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to the channel, Wild West Night, and like this video. For extra support, please consider hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people. Your support means the world.